This is Damian Macy, representing the Friends of the Marshall Public Library on our oral history project. And today is September the 24th of 2015, and I have the privilege of visiting with Butch Martin and his wife, Christina. They are not today residents of Marshall, but Butch has long-term roots here and family. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to Butch and let him tell his story.
Very good. Well, I was born here, born in Marshall, a lot of years ago, December the 8th, 1938. And my parents were Glenn and Lois Martin, and I had 7 siblings. The oldest was Laverne Martin, and he worked for Velsicol Chemical here for a lot of years. Then went from here out to Denver with Dr. Hyman, who was half owner of Velsicol at the time. He sold out to his cousin and opened a chemical company out around Denver, north and a little east of Denver, as I recall.
And your mother's name was?
My mother's name was Lois.
Lois
Martin. Okay. Then my brother, I had a brother Byron, a brother Dean, brother Robert, brother John, and a sister Edith, and a sister named Imogene. So that was, but I came along several years behind the rest of them. 7 were here, and the folks 10 or so years later, I showed up when they thought they were going to retire.
Surprise.
Yeah, surprise. And I lived in this community until I did a hitch in the Army and came back here, wound up working over in Terre Haute. I attended bar there and then got into bar management, restaurant management. I worked for Bill Ball out of Indianapolis in the old Huddle Systems restaurant. He had 2 companies, Huddle Systems and Meridian Restaurants, Inc., and I managed in both of those particular corporations. Got to the point where I couldn't advance. There was no more room at the top. So with his blessings, I joined a company called Southeastern Inns, and I was there for a few years. Went from there. Well, I looked around one morning and decided I had in the first place, the reason I got into attending bar and got into restaurants, I didn't feel like I wanted to be a farmer. That was just, there were certain things you had to shovel that I'd shoveled enough of, I figured, in my infinite wisdom. And so I called up the corporate office in Nashville, Tennessee, made an appointment, went down and turned in my resignation. I stayed on an extra month. They'd always been good to me, and I didn't want to leave with any bad graces, so to speak. So I stayed around until we had somebody that could take my place. I had, at one time, I had as high as about 20 restaurants that I was in charge of there. So I had a full boat. I had the company airplane and all that to fly me places that I wanted to go, and some places I'd rather not. But it's like I told them at the time. They said, where are you going? I said, I've heard Wyoming's a good spot. What are you going to do when you get there? I'm going to go fishing, and that's exactly what happened. I went to Wyoming and was there for many years. And wrote one book and started another one while I was there. The second book is just about finished. It should be in edit now. Went from corporate executive to driving a propane delivery truck.
What was the name of your book, Butch? The first book?
The first book is Spook.
Spook, huh?
The Adventures of a Wyoming Ranch Cat. And they have it here in the library.
Many of the second graders use it.
Oh, yes. Teachers love this book. The kids, they keep the kids' attention with it pretty good. So.
Go on, I just was interested in
No, that's okay.
Put that in there.
I hung out in Wyoming. I not only at the time that I was working for, it was the old CalGas Corporation that I worked for there, selling propane gas. And it took them 10 years to get me back into management. I managed for a while and then took my retirement. I'd been breeding Morgan horses in the meantime. I continued to do that on a little ranch outside of Shoshone, Wyoming. And then I finally gave up horse breeding. I was fortunate enough to get written up in a couple national magazines, of which I'm very proud. One being Western Horseman, and the other one is the Morgan Horse magazine. In '96, I moved clear out to Oregon, and I cowboyed on one ranch out there. I'd done quite a bit of cowboy work while I was in Wyoming, day working, you know, that sort of thing with some of the, and I feel very fortunate. I met some of the real old timers that really were real cowboys. People ask me today, said, "Are you a cowboy?" I said, "No, but I've ridden with some of the best." One of them I might mention, and I'm very proud of this, I think it was a blessing, was one that just died here a few months ago, and his name was Darrell Winfield. He was the #1 Marlboro cowboy. He was definitely a cowboy through and through. Ran many ranches, feedlots, that sort of thing, mostly ranches. And it was just a real awakening. My great uncle Bill, Will, we used to call him Uncle Will, had been an old time cowboy many years ago. He was born clear back in the 1800s and lived to a ripe old age. He was living in Paris, Illinois, up here when he passed, and I'm not sure how old he was, but I know he was close to 90. Wow. And when I was a young boy and a little kid, he would tell me stories about cowboy life, and I think most of them were true. That also got me to writing cowboy poetry later when I was in Wyoming. I've written a lot of cowboy poetry, and I appear on stage as a poet as well as a singer. Oh golly. I, of course, have family here still. My brother-in-law is Drexel Howard. He's a past postmaster.
You knew Drexel real well.
Yeah, and of course his wife was my sister, Edith. And naturally, of course, their children are my nieces and nephews. Craig Martin is my son. Kelly Schatz is a daughter. And Karen Cornwell, yes, is another daughter of mine. Right here that still live here in Marshall. Yeah, and did I forget
Steve
anybody?
Rogers and
Keith
Rogers,
Steve and Keith are my two sons. Keith lives in Wyoming, and Steve lives in South Carolina.
But they did spend a lot of time in Brazil earlier in their lives, too.
Yeah, they both worked.
Brazil, Illinois.
Yeah, they worked at the old Tracer Trailer Manufacturing Company over there for several years after they got out of high school.
And then Keith followed Butch to Wyoming, so he and his wife Barbara live in Wyoming.
Now Keith lives in Wyoming now, my oldest son.
And what part of Wyoming are you?
This was up in the Wind River Valley, and that is my ranch. If you go 96 miles straight west, 96 miles south. It always seems like west when I'm out there. 96 miles south of the Casper Airport, you'd be at the gate to my ranch that I had there. And that's down the Wind River Valley. The Wind River ran, well, my property almost bordered on the Wind River. There's a state park there, Boise State Park. But they owned about 100 yards of the property on each side of the river there as park, and my property joined that.
And I love to hear about the cattle drives that he did from there on the Pickard Ranch and some of these big ranches. He's very humble about his cowboy days, but he actually drove large cattle range.
Yeah, range
cattle.
We had every spring we would gather the cattle from the Pickard Ranch, for their winter ranch, and drive them 20 miles, cows and calves. And he had, I always say 600, he had between 600 and 650 mother cows. We would take half the herd at a time, We would go 10 miles the first day. Then we would put them into a place we called Stinking Wells. It was Old Sulphur Springs is what it was. And it was, the cattle loved it. And there was a lot of grazing right there. This is desert country, high desert. But around that Stinking Wells, we called it, there was a lot of good grass. So it was a natural place to leave them in overnight. And these little calves couldn't take a 20-mile drive anyhow. You'd run them in the ground. And, we'd move the herd along kind of slow. It was an all-day job to move them 10 miles, and we got up early, and we stayed late. But I always, every time that I was with them, I loved to be the one to stay with the cattle that first night. It was like taking a step back 100 years. And I don't think I ever slept. There was too much going on. And it was usually in that part of late April, early May. It seemed like there was just about always a full moon or near full moon when we'd make that drive. And it's hard to describe well, like I said, it's like taking a step back in time.
How many people would be on that cattle drive?
On that one, there would usually be six as high as 10 sometimes. You had your point man out front, which was usually the foreman, and then you had your 2 men on each side, one up toward the front of the herd, another near the rear of the herd on each side, and then you'd have 2 people in back that rode drag and ate a lot of dust. They were the ones that kind of pushed the stragglers along and made sure that some didn't try to dumble back to the home ranch, because once in a while you'd get one to do that, very rarely.
What about bad weather? Storm? Rain?
Never. All the times we moved them, I don't recall ever having a bad storm.
And yet, Butch reads to me these cowboy diaries. He'll read every morning. We do that at our Oregon ranch. We start off the day and he'll read old cowboy diaries from the 1800s, or we'll read stories like Roughing It, by Mark Twain, by Samuel Clemens. And then those drives, they had horrible lightning storms.
They did.
Because, they drove quite a number of more weeks. And that was something else.
One of my heroes, after I started really getting into the history of the West, was Charlie Goodnight. There is so much about that man that is his book, Charles Goodnight, Cattleman and Pioneer Baron, something like that. Just look up Charles Goodnight. I'll bet they've got it here in the library.
We need to get that one out again.
It's a biography of this man. Now, everybody that's ever watched a Western movie, of course, knows Lonesome Dove. What I found out in reading this was that incident of somebody getting struck by an arrow, getting poisoned, dying, and his friend going to be with him at his time of death did happen. Didn't happen up in Montana. It happened in Texas. If you read about the trails back then, there was one called the Goodnight Loving Trail. That was Charles Goodnight and his partner, Oliver Loving. Oliver was about 20 years older, as I recall, than Charles. He was injured in some sort of a fracas that involved Indians, and he was hit in the shoulder or in the upper arm with this arrow. It poisoned him. He got word back to Charlie that he was probably not going to make it. Charlie Goodnight was there the next day and rode 70 miles on a little Molly mule to be there.
That's quite a hike.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. And the thing that I found too, that there were more mules than horses ridden.
I had heard that one.
This is apparently true. There were horses that pulled wagons west, but there were more oxen and mules. The oxen was good to eat if you run out of anything else, and the mules never quit. The horses weren't as tough as the mules. Of course, there were exceptions, I'm sure, but that's generally the way it happened.
And that had to be such a rugged path to take.
Oh, it
Oh
was.
goodness, we drive it now and it's so simple and easy, but you look out there, my man, how did they make it?
Well, that's what we do with our Romancing the West. And Butch will tell you more about that, but we tell the story of the Western expansionism, and and when we read about how deep the salt desert was and how they got trodden down.
Oh, yeah, there in Utah, that was. They'd get bogged down and couldn't move anything. They have to take it apart and maybe build a cart out of what was left. But Christina and I have been, we visit a lot of these heritage centers and trail centers. And we're learning a lot more about the trials and tribulations that those people went through. Well, for instance, I was involved with a wagon train reenactment, the Applegate Trail. And our historian that traveled with us told about a canyon they went into, up a Canyonville.
Yes.
And I think there were either 6 or 8 wagons entered the canyon. There was only one reached the other side that was still all together. They'd had to take them apart, build carts. It was something. And they lost a lot of people. A lot of people died. I haven't visited Donner Pass. I've been over it.
But when we do perform at the California Trail Interpretive Center, they tell the story of the Donner Party that, of course, left the East too late in the season and were stuck at the foothills of the Sierra Nevada in snow, and that's a very harrowing story.
It's cannibalism.
But that does he brings it to life on stage with poetry and music. And I wrote Romancing the West, the actual documentary pieces, which Butch narrates with his wonderful voice. We co-narrate the piece, so it's a documentary concert that spans the history of the West.
240 years.
Yeah, and so that's kind of our life's work now,
Great.
Which is a big part of his oral history because it brings together his feeling, I believe, the hometown America that Marshall is. We have a whole tribute to hometown America. And from his stories, he tells me of Marshall and growing up and hearing the railroad go by and seeing those trains going west and all of the families farming. And that spirit has ended up in our life's work that we do together today.
That's what she based the whole thing on, is naturally the history of.
Butch, you mentioned your ranch.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a particular amount of acreage or something you have to be called a ranch?
Oh, you can have an acre and call it a ranch if you want to. It depends
I wasn't
on
sure
whether
that.
they're raising rabbits or cattle, I suppose.
Okay.
My place, I didn't have a whole lot of acreage that I owned there, but I had a lot of leased land that I ran horses on, and it was pretty reasonable. In Wyoming, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Having just come back from our trip, I picked up some realtors listings along the way, and ranch, and some of them were 300 acres, some of them were 5,000,
Right.
were for sale and all. So I said, there's surely some criteria that calls it a ranch.
There should be, I guess, but I don't think there is. One of the biggest ranches, I'll think of what they called it. I want to say the Toreador, but it's not the Toreador. Its home base was in Texas. I have ridden on a part of what was left of it up in Wyoming. Mr. Pickard had some of it leased for winter range, and just a little 25,000 acre patch, just a little patch.
But we always call our home in Oregon a ranch, even though it's a cabin and 26 acres. But to us it is. It has that feel because the big barn and everything, the giant barn.
But it was at one time, this outfit had a piece of ground there that was 25 miles across and over 100 miles long. And I got to know one of the old cowboys that used to go out with the wagon. They call it going out with the wagon. Going out with the wagon was going and gathering cattle, and they had the chuck wagons. Right? The chuck wagon was a chuck wagon and a bedroll wagon. So he was quite a fellow with horses. I got to tell his story. It's a short story, but it's a good one. He was a great horseman, and his name was Chuck Fenton. Chuck met his reward here not too long ago. I'm not sure the exact time, but he was a great horseman. He would take from 4 to 6 little Greenbroke horses, Greenbroke cow ponies, and then he'd go out with the wagon and be out with a month at a time. And when he come back in, there were people waiting to buy those horses because he was good. He was good. He knew how to train. He knew how to get inside a horse's head. My dad was like that, by the way. Glenn Martin was like. A lot of people didn't know that. It skips a generation. My oldest son's like that. They just have that sixth sense with horses. And I can ride. I can do okay. And they do a little bit of training once they're well started. But those guys had a certain my son has it, my dad had it, a real knack. It's just like they could look at a horse, be around a little bit, and know what they're thinking. And my dad loved mules too. Oh yeah, Glenn Martin loved mules. He said, if you can't get along with a mule, you just aren't very smart. Mules are smarter than most people.
And Glenn and Lois, they sang together in church.
Yes, they did. My folks, almost every Sunday, why that was one of the things at the old Pilgrim Holiness Church is where they went.
I was going to say, what church was that?
And they sang harmony.
It's the Wesleyan Methodist Church now, but or the Wesleyan Church. I forget just how they call it. Wesley was a Methodist, so of course it's the Wesleyan Methodist Church, in my opinion. But no, the folks sang every Sunday, and my mother played piano. Usually she didn't play piano when they were singing. They sang as a duet, and they did some beautiful harmonies. And of course, the church pianist would usually accompany them.
And then they'd have the pastors over for dinner and chicken dinners.
Oh yes.
Mm-hmm.
The itinerant, well, I call them the itinerant preachers. They were evangelists or whatever. My mother's cooking was famous. So when there was a revival meeting or a guest evangelist coming this Sunday, they usually wound up at our place for Sunday dinner. Of course, we had dinner.
They knew where the cooking was good.
Yeah, they knew, and it showed. My brother used to gripe, them darn chicken-eating preachers, he'd say.
But Butch got his name a special way. His name is Garnet Martin.
That's right.
And the way you got your name's kind of interesting.
Yeah, Don Senior Kessler, who died at the tender age of 99, not too awful long ago. His wife, Gladys, will rest her soul, one of the sweetest people I've ever known in my life. And she was always Aunt Gladdy to me. And she she and my mother were very close friends. So when I was born, my mother, in honor of Gladys, named me after her favorite nephew, whose first name was Garnet. That's how I got the name Garnet. There was another Garnet here in town. His last name was Elston, Garnet Elston. I remember him. There was one more named Garnet around here.
It's the Garnet Evola.
That's it. That's it. That was
what a beautiful name it is. But how you got the name Butch, how you received the name
Butch.
Butch
My dad brought
interesting.
a dog home when I was 2 years old, and the dog's name was Butch, and everywhere you'd see one, you'd see the other, and they started calling me Butch. And in my novel that I've written, I talk about that. It is a novel, and it's pretty well finished. Like I say, it's an edit, but I call it A Rustle in the Corn. And I recall as a little boy, my dog and I like to play all kinds of things out like kids do in the country, raised on the farm out here. And play until you were tired and then take a nap. And a lot of times it was in the cornfield. It was a corn group. And I remember that stayed in my mind, in the memory of my mind, I could always hear it. That little bit of breeze that comes through and moves the corn leaves. Well, 2 years ago, Christine had asked me many times, "There's a rustle in the corn, a rustle in the corn. What are you talking about, the rustle in the corn?" I tried to explain it to her and couldn't quite, so we were back here. We were out by Ted Snedeker's house. We were staying with Ted and his wife. They were great people.
Dear friends.
Ted and Kay. And we started to drive out there, and of course it was at the harvest festival time, and a lot of the corn was like it is today, beginning to ripen real well. And I pulled over at the side of the road and rolled down the window. She said, "What's the matter?" I said, "Listen."
It was so
She got
beautiful.
it right away.
But that's the kind of things we do, and is together. You know, are always enjoying, you know, endless new discoveries. You know, when we're out, the sun setting, the sky a certain purple twilight. I mean, I love the fact that we still, you know, that we are ever noticing those things, and I think that kind of comes from a small town upbringing.
Now, did I get the name of this new book? Is Rustle in the Corn?
Hey, Rustle
Yes.
in the Corn.
That's what, and then he's writing a second novel right now called The
Whippoorwill at Midnight. Mm-hmm. It's about the war between the states.
Mm-hmm.
Whippoorwill in the moonlight?
Whippoorwill at midnight.
At midnight.
At midnight.
A whippoorwill at midnight.
And that is about this.
It's about the times surrounding the war between the states, the Civil War.
But there's this love story involved too.
Oh, it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a work in progress.
So in your travels, are you finding things then that kind of become maybe part of a book, or something that gives you an idea about what to write about?
Somewhat. I would love to, so I could say my one son, Steve, lives in South Carolina, and I would love for Christina and I to be able to go there, which we plan to do it. I want to go there because A Whippoorwill at Midnight takes place. That's where this family is from. And I guess the basic thing is the father was a shipbuilder who loses his wife to cancer. He has a little son that's 2 years old. He takes another woman, and then who is black. And I'm going to give too much of a story away here, but she's French, black, and these two sons build a bond like you wouldn't believe. One's multiracial, the other's all white. When the war between the states breaks out, the one who is black goes to the south, and the other brother goes to the north. And I've heard some of these things, basically how some of them happen, and have heard when I was living in the South. I was of course I was based out of Nashville, but our corporate leader was from Huntsville, Alabama. So I heard a lot of stories that were passed down from their ancestors, and of course I'd heard the stories up here. My great-grandfather was in the Civil War. He was at the battle down by Nashville. Oh, I'll think of the
I
name.
don't remember. I wish I could help you with that.
Yeah, you were. But that was David Radford Martin, and he had a big reputation here in the county. I had an old gentleman one time saying, let's see, your dad's Glenn Martin, yeah. Said, well, his dad was Ulysses Grant Martin, or his dad was Grant Martin, yeah. He said, then was your... He said, I remember Rad Martin. David Radford Martin was my great-great-grandfather. He died here and was up in his 90s or near 90. He was a Civil War vet. If he'd lived another 10 years, I'd have met him. But this fellow, his name was Hennig or Henning, something like that. He said, I remember Rad Martin. Yeah? He said, I'll tell you one thing about Rad Martin. He said, if he said, I'm going to be there, he was there. He said, you talk about a man that kept his word. He said he kept it almost to a fault.
I can even think back to the time that my dad was in business. If he shook hands with someone, it was a contract. And really that meant more than a whole stack of legal papers does today.
It does, it does. Mike Logan, a cowboy poet I know up in Montana, he was a retired school teacher. He was raised around Coffeyville, Kansas. His father spent his lifetime practically racing trotting horses and pacers, and was good at it. He was well known. But he wrote a poem called "There Was a Time," and that's what it was. It was about, said there was a time when a handshake meant more than a contract.
Yep.
Now, and when you gave your hand to man, you took a solemn vow. And then he goes on about how it's changed. It's a beautiful piece of work, and
that's the kind of thing that we with civil rights and all the things you've been talking about are the
Sure.
kinds of things that we've been doing in today's work, because of all having been through all these things.
well, we run just for instance, we were just coming across at Neely, Nebraska, which is where Christina's grandmother came from. Before she became a chorus girl, right?
She did. She was a chorus line dancer with Olson and Johnson, the famous comedy team, and then met my grandpa on the road, and the rest is my oral history for another date.
But we were in Neely, and we were very well received. My golly, they said, well, we'll get a few people. We want you to come to the library and put on one of your shows, which we did. A short version of Romancing the West, which we do it for, libraries like we did here, and the trail centers and what. So we find that, we hear and we talk about the suffering that the Native American people took. They say I'm part Kickapoo, but I don't know if that's true or not. That story my grandma used to tell on the Tingley side. Incidentally, I'm related to the Tingleys. My grandmother was Tingley. Mm-hmm. So on my father's side. But anyhow, we bring out this a lot, but there were also some things that happened that were good. And one that we found in Neely, there is a grave. They took us out to the graveyard, showed us this grave, and showed us where some of her relatives are buried. The little white buffalo girl, the Ponca Indians were being chased. This Ponca Indian and his wife came to the people in that town with their dead child, little girl. They asked those people if they would give her a Christian burial and take care of her grave. They were on the run. They did it. And they're still doing it. And it's to this day, it's there. It's there. I tell you, I get choked up when I think about it, because you think of what had happened with those people here. They have come to apparently believe in what most of us believe in Christianity in this country, and they thought that was the best thing they could do. They had no way to take care of their dead child. They asked those people to do it, and they do it proudly. That grave is maintained, decorated.
You hit on such a point, because as I say, we just finished a 5,000-mile trip and visited a number of the Indian reservations and sites and museums on those. Oh. And I don't think anyone can appreciate the real devastation that they were forced on them. Yeah. And the loss of the buffalo, which was their whole
they engineered that.
And that was so purposefully done.
They did that. To them. They took their food away from them.
And they made contracts and then wiped them off.
Yeah, as long as the grass grows and the water flows, unless we find gold or oil, and then your ass is out.
And then the Nez Perce have been wonderful.
The Nez Perce
we've been up there a number of times. They're great folks.
Yeah.
I mean, and then Butch met one of his relatives, is one of the tribal leaders in Mammoth Lakes, because in Corbin, Kentucky, the mother of that gentleman that's the tribal leader out there.
She was from
she was related to Butch from the Corbin, Kentucky Martins.
Yeah.
So it was very interesting. We were just performing there, and they went back and they started talking about Corbin, Kentucky, and how they were from, their relatives had descended from there. And sure enough, he's, you know, the cultures are, by now, you know, there's a lot of cultural crossover between the different.
There was, and he was, I said, well, this is, well, I'm from the Martins, Corbin, Kentucky. Really? And so we started talking, and he knew about Martin. He knew that they were descended from that line of Martins. And we've been corresponding quite a bit since. Right now his dad's quite ill. We haven't corresponded much the last 3 or 4 weeks. But he had gone back and talked to his father, and he said, I can't wait for you and my dad to get together.
It was the father's side, not the mother's.
It was the father's side.
The mother
right.
was the native side. But you're right. The interesting part was that he said that many of the relatives' photographs, the ancestors look like Butch.
Get way back over
He has some strong genes that end up in all the kids.
I've been looking at some of my Martin relatives from Corbin. They all look like Butch.
These genes are very strong. All of these Martins around here do too.
We, in our trip, had occasion to visit with some Nez Perce folks on one of the reservations, and another time at it was a buffalo empire, where they had 500 and some buffalo.
Yes.
And they were just delightful to talk to, and I was kind of surprised the ones we talked to had basically no dialect. It sounded almost like, you know, someone that had lived here all their life, and I guess they have, of course.
Yeah.
There was something they did that I'm just proud as hell of. We went up there 3 years ago, right at we were there at Christmas time. We were going to hook it back down to the Grand Pass area to spend Christmas, and we couldn't do it. We stayed with them. Had a nice Christmas dinner.
It was there. They had to do a big buffet.
Oh yeah, and of course, there in that particular case where it was go through and seat yourself, the elders of course were fed first and seated and that, but and they honored us to come join them. We did. Anyhow, and that one's usually a big carry-in, but we were there 3 days instead of 1. So we spent Christmas with them. But when we went back to powwow that next summer, and up by Wallawa, this is the name of the little town, isn't it?
It would actually, yeah, it is in
ground,
Wallawa. That's their grounds there.
So we go there for the powwow, camp out, and the last day. This is all done in the round and under, you know, a nice big rounded roof, and it's open out in the center, and probably 100 yards across, I guess, from one side to the other.
The typical powwow ground type thing.
So the last day they're having the big dinner celebration. In this case, the elders are seated, and the youngsters bring dishes, bring the food to them. Very honorable. We're sitting out here in the round, and here's these long tables out in front of us. There's 3 or 4, and they were, oh golly, 50 feet long. And the table right out in front of us, maybe 30 feet out from us, was filled up till there were only 2 seats left, right straight ahead and facing toward us. And we're looking at each other, I wonder if we're going to put somebody there. And then 2 people walk up there and motion us to come and sit.
It was nice. Yeah. It was an honor to sit with
the
wonderful elders.
That would be a major honor.
It was very wonderful because their families and their culture, we just have so loved the way that they teach their children and the generations how to honor their elders, which is what Marshall was like in the 40s and the 50s, and I'm sure by the looks of things today that, you know, people are carrying those values on.
Oh yes, they are. I mean, there's exceptions to all rules, but it's ingrained pretty heavy there. An amusing thing that happened too, we met this fellow who had long white hair, straight white hair down his back, white man. His last name was Howard. He was a great, I think 2 or 3 times removed grandson of General Howard, who was chasing the Indians. And we found out a lot about General Howard. General Howard was very sympathetic to Chief Joseph's cause.
After the fact.
And he was ordered to chase him, and he had to. He didn't want to. And I mean, he lost troops, they lost Indians and everything, but General Howard respected and he thought a lot of Chief Joseph. After they'd run him into the ground, and he said, "I will fight no more forever," which is all true. He went to Washington to speak for Chief Joseph and his people. He tried his best, did everything he could that we know of, to get their grounds back there at Wallowa Lake Wallowa, to no avail. So anyhow, his great-great-grandson shows up, and we get to know him. Paul's his name, heck of a nice guy. We're chatting with him, and he tells us about what happened to him a few years earlier. He had gone to the powwow, presented himself to the tribe, and he says, "I'm the general's great-great-great-grandson. And I feel as he did, but there needs to be some kind of atonement." So they set up this ceremony. He said they put him out in the round, and he had his hair clear down to the schmobies back then too. He said the biggest, meanest looking Indian in the world I ever saw come out there with the dullest knife ever created, and he sawed his hair off across the back of his head. He just sawed and sawed, and I thought I never was going to let go. He said the tears were running, and he said I wanted to scream and couldn't. Of course, he's accepted as a very dear friend.
He's one of the most honored friends there.
So was that one of the things in the cutting of the hair that really kind of, I guess, solidified a piece?
It was
an atonement for them?
a symbol. It was a symbol that they were sort of
kind of a forgiveness thing, and of course, the tribe knows what General Howard tried to do after the fact.
Yeah.
It was hard for them, I'm sure. It would be anybody. Well, if he felt we were that right, why did he chase us? Well, he was a West Point graduate.
They influenced.
He follows it,
They told us about Chief Seattle's speech.
Oh, yeah.
And that's one of the greatest speeches, speaking of going to the government and trying to get remedy. Chief Seattle's speech is one of the most incredible speeches ever written in defense of a people and to try to get their lands back.
Absolutely. He was a brilliant, brilliant human being. Chief Seattle was, I don't know who I could compare him to. If you ever get a chance to read the things about this man and the things that he said about life and about people, about atonement.
Eternity.
And about eternity, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It was, I mean, was he educated? I don't know if he could even read.
Probably.
Well, his own language, their language is so intricate themselves.
Well, their language, yeah, true.
And the language that they spoke when they did the prayer, they did Chief Joseph's prayer in their language in our show.
Yeah, that was an honor.
Thomas Morning Owl did such a beautiful job, and that was really one of our most special times together up on the mountains over the Native American grounds.
That became an interesting conversation that I had with one of the Nez Perce. We were talking about language, and I said, "Was this ever written down?" And he said, "No, it all was verbal and carried down, but now they are beginning to restore a lot of that and write some of it down so that they can keep the next generation aware of what the language was."
They sure are. The Shoshones are doing, I sat in the sweat lodge a lot when I was there, and I would today if there was a good one around. I'm a Christian, but I started following the Red Road, and my spiritual guide is darn sure a Catholic, but there's not that difference that people think. Well, that's a whole nother story, but I started that when I was up in the Wind River Valley, and I've never been sorry, ever.
Well, it seemed like many people, at least earlier, thought of the Indians as, quote, savages, but yet they had a spiritual belief, and they were in belief of a superior being.
They did.
And oftentimes there were, even in their myths and legends, Christ-like stories. And the thing was is that instead of the white people coming and listening to what they had already had as a revelation, they tried to, of course, conform them into their own image culturally, and that's what we talk about in our documentary.
Yeah, Christina brings that out really well.
Yeah, the thing when I was a little girl, my favorite movie was How the West Was Won, and the funny thing about it is that I was always adamant about. Even as a little girl, I did reports on the tribes, and so I always felt that they weren't telling the whole story. And so it's been a wonderful blessing to go around the country, together, the two of us, and do this what we do.
You mentioned Nebraska, and in Kearney, I believe it's Kearney, Nebraska. There's the museum that's built over the highway.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sure you have probably visited that.
I've seen it in pictures. We have not.
We have visited.
We have not. Now
We've
that's
got to do
Kearney.
it.
But that has such an impact in my mind of the trials and tribulations that those early settlers had in trying to get to the West.
Yes.
It's really fascinating.
We've got to get there.
Okay.
Martin Gershowitz, who's traveling with us right now, is one of our best friends. Martin Gershowitz was in the rock band Iron Butterfly and in the Animals, and he's of German descent, and so we spoke to him about how in Europe they viewed the Western story, and of course he said romantically and from the cowboy and Indian movies that he never knew until really working with us and coming here to America how it really was. And so he was sharing that now everybody knows, because documentarians all over the world have told the real story. But to get here and see it in person, and
I think that's so many times the news media and theaters and all, it's a romanticized thing that it really may not be all factual.
Yeah.
See, Danny Macy, that was Joe's son, wasn't it?
Yes, he's my cousin.
He's your cousin.
Yeah,
I was trying to think of his...
He passed away.
Yeah.
At a very early age. He was only 57, I believe.
Really?
He had a heart attack. He worked for the Pentagon in Washington.
That's enough to give anybody a heart attack.
Mm-hmm.
That's not very humorous.
But he was he jogged and played tennis and everything. And he and his wife were in a tennis match somewhere. And they finished with that and were visiting and went out to the car, and he got behind the wheel and passed away.
Oh, that's the way things go.
I see one of the questions on here. I can't let this go by. One of the questions on here is, what historical events stand out in your mind?
I was going to ask that, but you're right there with it.
One of the most, I'd say the most, that stands out, and this is of course my opinion. I know I'm right, but not everybody's going to agree with me. One of the most horrendous, stupid things, in my opinion, that we ever got involved with was called Vietnam. I was in the first part of the war, whatever you want to call it, police action. I was of the, my thought was kill them all and let the Lord sort them out. That's how smart I was. Here a while back, I want to jump forward a few years. Here a while back, and this comes out in our show, Romancing the West. We talk about it a bit, but this that I ran across brings the story out better than I could ever think of doing it. I didn't write it. I wish I could say I did. But anyhow, to make a long story short, the recording label I'm on is BSW Records out of Texas, which is owned by a fellow named Frank Wilson, and he's an old sergeant major. And he sent me this song, a demo, and it's called After the War. So he said, "You've got to record this one, Butch. Man, this is good. You got to record it. It's right down your alley." He sends it to me, sends the lyric sheet, sends the demo being sung by a person. I read it. She's probably tired of hearing this story because I tell it a lot.
I don't get tired of hearing his
But
stories.
what happened was I read that and I began to choke up. I listened to the music and I said, no. I called Frank. See, I'm still dialing, that's how old I said, he said, oh, did you get After the War? I said, yeah, I got it. Well, you need to record that. I said, it isn't a song, Frank. What do you mean it's not a song? I said, it's not a song. We argued a little bit in a good-natured sort of way. I said, you got time to listen? Well, I guess so. This is it. My name's Billy Johnson, and Indiana's my state. I turned 21 back in 1968. Drafted into the Army, sent to Fort Leonard Wood. When I left my hometown, I prayed it wasn't for good. But his name was Hector Gonzalez, and he came from San Jose. We got stuck on KP that very first day, and after peeling potatoes for hours on end, well, Hector and I were the closest of friends. When they put us on a troop plane and flew us to Nam, some guy stood up in the back and read the 23rd Psalm. Well, we talked for a while about that valley of death. I said, Hector, I'm scared. He said, just take a deep breath. When we reached our destination and our assignments came in, he went to play coup. I was sent to Long Bend. But Hector hugged me goodbye and turned around at the door saying, don't forget to look me up after the war. Well, 3 months later, Hector wrote me a letter. He said, some days are tough and some days are better. And a kid named Gallardo we knew from basic training was missing in action up north. And by the way, I meant what I said before. Now, don't forget to look me up after the war. Well, I was out on patrol in the spring of '69 when I stepped on a tripwire, took some shrapnel from a mine. I spent the rest of my tour in a hospital bed with pins in my legs and a plate in my head. But on that plane ride home, I thought of all I'd been through. I'd lived 9 lives. I was just 22. And I thought about Hector and the promise before, and I meant to look him up right after the war. Well, it was many years later in Washington, D.C., and I was there on vacation with my family. I went out to the park to see that wall and live up to a past I didn't want to recall. First, I looked for the name Hector wrote me about, but he wasn't on the list. I guess he lucked out. Then my eyes caught the name at the top of the page. Corporal Hector Gonzalez, 21 years of age. My throat got tight and my mouth went dry as I looked up at that wall and I started to cry. As those memories hit me like incoming fire of a time when we were so young, and Hector waving goodbye from the door, saying, don't forget to look me up after the war. No, don't forget to look me up after the war.
Very well said.
Kind of says it all, doesn't it? I get on stage and do that sometimes, and I choke up so bad I can't really do it.
And there's the moving wall, which of course is a good location.
I visited.
It's been here in Marshall.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Good.
And then we were in Washington. We visited the original
the real
out
one.
there.
Yeah, well,
And it's really quite it's so simple, but yet it's so moving.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it really is touching.
Yeah.
They had the moving wall. In fact, the first time I did that after the war, I had just got that down where I could do it, where I could recite it.
Put it on there.
So thank you. It says so much about where we've been, what we have come to. Why do we get involved in things like this? And where are we headed, for God's sake?
Right now, it seems like the whole world is in such a turmoil.
It is.
And that's
Just scary.
It's very scary, and that's why these things are so important. Just remembering a time when things were grounded and rooted. And I had a couple thoughts. The teachers that you've expressed to me that you love, like Mrs. Perkins.
Oh, Mrs. Perkins, Mrs. Genevieve Perkins.
Yes, you
that
know
was
her.
one of the best things. That I owe I have to say, I owe my poetry talent to 2 people, and she's one of them. The other one was my father, Glenn. He never wrote poetry that I ever knew of, but he was a great reciter. And I guess that got ingrained in me when I was small. And I didn't really start writing poetry until, oh my goodness, 1982, I think it was, when I wrote my first poem. And then it kind of went on from there. And I've got poetry albums out and everything. I need to do a book of my own poems.
I was just getting ready to ask, had you considered putting those together in a bound volume?
I need to.
For the future.
I need to. I've done a lot, I've written quite a few, and I've gotten some pretty good results from them, and most of them are cowboy poetry. Some of them are humorous. But a strange thing, I don't know if it's the same way with all poetry, but with cowboy poetry, people go to hear cowboy poetry to laugh. They really do. And they get rewarded, of course, with the laughs, the funny stuff. But I got one that I did for for a fellow. I called him my brother. We were adopted in the Shoshone Sweat Lodge. We took vows of brotherhood. That was Lawrence.
Yes.
And incidentally, his people came from Corbin, Kentucky too. They weren't related to us. But anyway, I remember Mrs. Perkins, the poems that she used to do. One was the second verse in Thanatopsis. I didn't even know the name of the poem, but I've heard her do it a time or two, and years later, 20, 30 years later, I remember all of it.
Mm-hmm. Now, the other teacher you mentioned, a man that talked about the way the world was going.
Oh, that was Mr. Marks, that taught American history, 7th grade. And he had some real staunch opinions as to where we were headed. And he was right.
Probably right.
He was right. Way back then, 1952. Oh, what the heck are they talking about? We're over in Korea. We're killing communists. Yeah, we stopped the 38th parallel, too, instead of finishing the war. I just can't. I look at what potentially is happening to our generations coming along now. Children, grandchildren, I have great-grandchildren. Where is this thing going?
It's honestly scary.
Mm-hmm.
It is scary. And it goes right back to what we were talking about earlier. There was a time when a handshake meant more than a contract now.
And I'm going to ask your opinion of something because we're touching on this right now, and you see all the kids going down the street, and adults too. They're texting
Yes.
or they're on the cell phone, and they're oblivious to what's going on around them even.
Exactly.
Where does this go?
Going to hell in a basket.
It's very hard because you on the one hand, it's a blessing and a curse. Not the part about them being in there all the time, but I'm saying it's wonderful to be across the country and be able to keep track of your grandkids on Facebook, but to be able to go in quickly at a certain time of day and do it, and then be present in your everyday life is the challenge.
I don't think there's anything, and the cell phone cannot wait probably 30 minutes.
Oh, exactly.
But everyone has to be instant.
Right.
I can. The cell phone's been it's a blessing and a curse. These electronic devices have gotten into our minds to the point we think we can't live without them. We did quite well before. How do we keep up with the world without doing that? I'm not sure. But I ran into a fellow. I work forest fires in the summertime. For the biggest.
We saw a few of those.
Yeah. Yes, that was scary.
I was on the National Fire in Oregon, and I was on I was on 4 different ones this year. And there I met a fellow who was amazing. A new guy on the block came in. He was working at the same company I was. I was driving a potable water truck. He come in to relieve the driver of another potable water truck on this big camp we were in. Got talking to him, and I asked him something about, what's your background? Where'd you come from? But he was a nice guy. He said, well, I never knew my dad. Oh, I don't know who he was. He said, my mother had 6 children by 5 different men. She was a She was a rainbow girl and believed in free love. And I thought, boy, where's this going? Then he began to tell me his history. This guy, and I told him, I said, Dana, if you don't write a book, you need your shins kicked. He's coming up during that era. I'm not sure how old Dana is now, probably 40 or so. Wouldn't you imagine he's 40?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This guy is I have never seen a better family man, and the way anybody could take a lesson from as to how you're supposed to do it. Well, he's got a wife that loves him. He's got a son and a daughter that love him, but here's his rules. And believe me, they love him. There's no doubt in my mind. They came out to the camp to visit him. He had made arrangements for his little girl, always wanted a kitty. And his little girl was, what, 10 or 12 years old?
Yeah, she was
sweet. We got
sweet.
pictures of that. And there was a kitty showed up in camp, and he said, boy, I'd like to have that for her. He gives her that kitty when she gets there, and it's, oh, Daddy, and she's crying and petting the kitty. And I mean, this was pure, honest to God, family love in spades.
The neat thing, Oh, go ahead, you finish.
Come to find out what he told me, the short version, he showed up around Shasta, Big Mount Shasta, and at that town of Shasta, when he was wanting to go to high school there. He was on his own. He said, well, your mother or your father has to sign you in here. I don't know where she is. I don't know who my father is. Somebody remembered her name. She had been there years earlier with another child, signed the papers for that child to be educated there. And they, on that basis, they thought enough of him. Here's why. He was on his own, making his own way, working a job, keeping his own apartment. You're going to say no to somebody like that? Today he couldn't do it.
Well, but
he did then.
Yeah, the neat thing about it is the personal responsibility issue of not, and a lot of us have broken pieces in our life. In fact, there's been a lot of broken pieces but mended recently in Butch's life.
Right.
I think mistakes that were made and broken families. And to be quite honest, you know, there's been things that needed to be mended there, but you know, everybody's taken, you know, the responsibility to come back and say, the fourth quarter could be the strongest quarter of our lives. We don't want to gloss over the fact that there were those things, and that there was healings that needed to be made even in your own family, and
sure.
And those things, that's what I'm so proud of you for having done, is to come back and done so. And the same thing with your kids. They've had a lot of personal responsibility in their lives and had families of their own, and been strong individuals.
Done very well. But getting back to the electronic thing, I got off the subject a little bit, sorry about that. I asked him, I said, well, okay, what about the cell phones and that sort of thing? He said, oh yeah, my kids have cell phones. They do, yeah. You've got, when you go to shower, it's 6 minutes. We take marine showers at my house, he says. Yes, you're allowed the internet, cell phone, Facebook, 1 hour a day.
That's a great idea.
1 hour a day.
Wonderful.
I don't care. You take your pick, whichever you want to do. If you want to do the internet today and Facebook tomorrow, or however, that's up to you. That's fine. And we're very careful about what we watch on television. And he said, and you know something? He said, no problem.
It works.
It works for parents and it works for adults. You know, we've started to make sure there's certain, you know, you go in, you go out. You go into your Facebook, you check it. You go into your email and you check it. But you don't have to respond that minute.
When it becomes a way of life, to me, it's the worst kind of social intercourse there ever was.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just,
I'm appalled by it.
oh man.
Yeah.
I just, it's.
Well, Butch, one thing I ask people, I say, you know, we've got so many conveniences around us.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that you've got, say, I really couldn't live without that?
I could live without a telephone. I could do it. Would I want to? Not particularly. Could I do it? Yes. The U.S. mail, we'd have to have that at least.
Mm-hmm.
Do we absolutely have to have a computer? Not really. Well, not when it comes right down to it. There was something my dad used to talk about, and it means a lot then. It meant a lot then. It means a lot now. It's called Yankee ingenuity. Excuse me. How do you keep up with the rest of the world if the rest of the world is doing this? You're forced. We're forced, at least at government level, which that's another bone of contention I have. One government has to know what the other doing so they don't kill the whole damn world. But is there a common place where this could be equalized? No. We're always having to stay ahead of the other guy, always having to stay ahead of the other. Where's that going to end? I have my theory where it's going to end, and I don't think it's a theory. I think we're going to see a far greater power than we have ever thought of, except maybe in our Holy Bible, has got to get us out of this mess, because we've sure made a big one.
Well, being on the internet so much, and so much of your personal information being out there is it's very easy, should any government ever go bad and have all of that information accessible to them. If Hitler would have had it, for example, all of the back end of all of this internet information,
sure,
it would have been devastating to the world.
And I really think we're seeing that now with all the quote hacking and stuff that takes place, and everything is computerized. And it's not secret.
Right.
There's always some guy that's going to be able to get into it with China and probably Japan and Russia. And
I think one of the most brilliant people alive today is Netanyahu.
I've always loved him. Very courageous man, isn't he?
I'm not a Bible banger or anything like that, but this is all been, we've been warned about this. I'll tell you another thing. I think what would cure the ills in our country, one of the things that I really believe would put our country on the straight and narrow. It'll never happen, but it should. Every child, in order to graduate high school, would be required to do a passing grade on the Federalist Papers and our Constitution as it was written.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Before they could ever graduate from high school or go for any college education.
Might not even hurt for them to learn a prayer.
No, a prayer. In fact,
right along with that.
Right along with
the
spiritual implications. The spiritual implications of school prayer being taken out.
They say
it has. You can notice marked changes in the culture from then on.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And when I know back in the 60s, the revolt, my generation, the revolt we had against war. At the time, I thought, what's the matter with, we always say that peace symbol, that's the great American chicken track. No, by golly, you know something, the kids were right. In my opinion, they were right. Vietnam was wrong. We're going into another war that we have no business even thinking about. And I think there were certain people taken out of this world that should have been left in this world. I didn't vote for it at the time, but I'd vote for it today, because I think he was right. And things that are being uncovered now, and every once in a while somebody writes about it, they do a documentary on it with all of the proof in the world. It just...
We're right in the same generation, I think the same ideas, and I guess maybe have we solved all the problems of the world today?
No, but I'm actually in one of the next generations, and I feel the same way about those things.
Yes.
As far as, my family has always been, very, even though we were California.
Well, Orange County, though, that's a little different.
Yeah, Orange County is very special in a lot of ways.
I like Orange County.
It is. It's. Have you been there to San Juan Capistrano?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The thing about it is that that hometown American values, you know, are something that are alive and well in even cities.
Hey, that's showing right here in Marshall a lot. I
Very
gotta
much.
say it.
And that's one thing I was going to kind of wrap things up with, which I usually ask people. If you're traveling somewhere and you say, I'm from Marshall, Illinois, say, where is that or what's that all about? What would you tell them about Marshall and why it might be a good place to visit?
I'd tell them what happened when we came back here 2 years ago. I hadn't been in Marshall since, I think the last time I was through here was in '92. And I still have a little ranch in Wyoming then. And I could see then that the town was beginning to look a little bit like something I will do you a poem about. Kind of slipping, you know. It was beginning to look a little shabby around the edges and getting a little bit dog-eared. We came back here 2 years ago and I said, oh my God, what happened?
It was really well
The place, it
maintained.
never was a dirty town, but it was super clean. The streets looked nice. Oh, there's a few businesses that aren't open anymore in the main street, but overall, and it's been growing. I was really, really proud. I tell people that are in some of these towns that are going that direction. And I noticed poor old Paris, Illinois up here. I mean, oh man, it just, Marshall would have looked like that had enough of the city fathers got together and for whatever, well, I know what the reason, of course, was to do what they did accomplish, and they're still accomplishing. This town is looking pretty doggone good.
It's a great model, great model for surrounding cities, and we were very impressed.
But we, Christina and I run across this a lot, going across the country.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah.
We, and David McKechnie, who wrote for Kenny Rogers, John Denver, Marilyn McCool, oh goodness, the list goes on and on, sent me another, well, every once in a while I get a song sent to me, and I don't want it to be a song just like After the War. But we do this in the show, and we do it after Backroads, isn't it?
Yeah, Backroads.
After the song Backroads that she wrote. And it's called Where My Hometown Went. See that rundown building with the cracked glass door? That used to be Bramer's Country Hardware Store. Concrete blocks, 2x4s, 3 screws for a dime, and put it all on the tab, pay it down over time. Well, now there's a box store at the outskirts of town. That's where we all shop since Bramer's ain't around. So town ain't broken, but it sure is badly bent, because somebody tell me where my hometown went. Then there's that little theater where I had my first date. Well, it's a pawn shop now, with an iron barred gate. And all the shops around it are boarded up and locked. There's paint spray words on every wall around the whole damn block. Welcome to the town of for sale or for rent. Somebody tell me where my hometown went. All those green leafy trees that grew on Main Street stand broken, dead, and dying in the crumbled up concrete. Yes. Welcome to the town of for sale or for rent. Can somebody tell me where my hometown went?
I love it.
Unpainted and uncared for. Oh, there's still old Johnson's covered bridge at the outskirts of town, and that's where Mr. Johnson lives since the bankers took him down. But under that bridge is cold at night, but to him it's heaven sent. And somebody tell me where my hometown went. Unpainted and uncared for, little towns across the land just aren't the same as they were yesterday. Seems that reaching out, bending down with a helping hand are some of the first to fade away.
I love it. And I might come back and say, there's a program with the National Trust called Main Street.
Yeah,
Maybe you've heard of that.
I've heard of it.
And we are a Main Street community.
Mm-hmm.
And that has really been one of the real sparks that kind of got things
And people working
fixed
together.
and improved.
And I agree. having been, Jacksonville, Oregon is a historic mining town where I lived for many years and was on the council, and were a big part of a lot of the cities that revitalized throughout Oregon as well.
Yeah.
We've worked together in that town a lot, and it looks a lot like Marshall.
I was chairman of the Historic Preservation Commission for several years,
Yeah.
and was able to get the downtown listed on the National Register too.
That is wonderful. Yeah,
And
that's what the
7
two towns
individual
have
sites also.
have in common.
Butch, it has been a real delight visiting with you and Christina.
Thank
We
you.
certainly appreciate your participating and taking the time out of your schedule to participate in the Oral History Project. And this is really, as I said, not for today necessarily or tomorrow, but for the future.
Sure.
And certainly when we've got someone who is not living here now, but grew up here, that even adds a little extra dimension to what we're doing. And I want to thank you folks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Been our
Really
It's been a pleasure.
appreciate it. Thank you.